When someone demands that you surrender your self-respect or walk away, they usually assume you lack the courage to leave. I stood in the middle of a crowded backyard while an entire room full of relatives stared at me with smug satisfaction. My husband had just drawn a line in the sand, expecting me to crumble under the pressure. Instead, I looked at his face and realized that our marriage was already over. My name is Clara, and at 34 years old, I spent 6 long years trying to make a marriage work with a man who put everyone else first. My husband, Brandon, was a good father to our 3-year-old son Leo, but he was completely incapable of standing up to his family. His mother and sister had dictated every aspect of our lives, and Brandon constantly forced me to take the blame just to keep peace. The afternoon that shattered everything started as a simple family cookout at my mother-in-law's home. Dozens of relatives were gathered around the patio, laughing and chatting while the sun began to set. Leo was sitting quietly beside me, eating some fresh sliced peaches, when my mother-in-law marched over with an irritated look on her face. She immediately scoffed and began criticizing me for restricting my son's sugar intake. I calmly explained that our pediatrician had advised us to limit processed sweets for Leo's health, but she simply rolled her eyes in frustration. Before I could even finish my sentence, Brandon's sister chimed in with a sarcastic insult about my parenting choices. Several relatives snickered out loud, and I felt a wave of embarrassment wash over me. I decided right then that I was done staying silent after years of endless disrespect. When I defended my right to follow medical advice for my own child, the atmosphere shifted instantly into open hostility. My mother-in-law threw her hands up, loudly declaring that I was being deeply disrespectful to the entire family. Within seconds, multiple relatives began jumping into the conversation, accusing me of ruining the gathering. I looked at Brandon, desperate for him to say something, but he just sat there silently watching me suffer. Seeing my husband remain completely silent hurt far worse than any insult his sister had hurled at me. Out of pure exhaustion, I began speaking the truth, laying out how years of constant criticism and passive-aggressive comments had worn me down. I spoke calmly without shouting, but my words sent shockwaves through the crowd. Brandon suddenly slammed his glass down on the table, looking embarrassed and furious at my honesty. My husband stood up, his face flushed with anger, and barked at me to stop talking immediately. When I refused to back down, he pointed directly toward the front door and issued an ultimatum. He told me to apologize to his family right then or pack my things and get out. The entire yard fell dead silent, everyone waiting for me to break down and apologize like I had done so many times before. Instead of crying or arguing, I quietly stood up and walked into the guest room where Leo was sleeping peacefully. I packed our bags, strapped my son into his car seat, and drove away without saying another single word. That night, sitting alone in the quiet kitchen, I realized that 6 years of endless compromising had completely destroyed my self-worth. I knew right then that I was never going back to that toxic dynamic. Late that evening, I remembered an old friend living in New Zealand who had offered me a job position 3 years prior. I sent her a message, expecting nothing, but she responded within an hour saying the company had expanded and desperately needed someone. Within 3 days, I completed multiple online interviews, accepted the official offer, and purchased 2 one-way airplane tickets for myself and my son without asking anyone for permission. For the next 2 weeks, I played the part of a normal wife while secretly preparing our entire international relocation. My friend helped me secure an apartment, enroll Leo in a wonderful local early learning center, and finalize all necessary legal paperwork. Meanwhile, Brandon sent short texts assuming I would eventually apologize, while his mother called repeatedly to lecture me about family unity without ever offering an actual apology. 3 weeks after the backyard incident, everything was fully prepared for our flight across the world. The night before we left, Brandon came home with takeout food, acting as though a simple meal would erase years of mistreatment. He smiled confidently and said he was glad we were finally moving past the drama. I looked at him in complete silence, feeling a strange sense of pity for a man who still had no idea what was happening. The next morning, while Brandon was at work, I loaded our suitcases into a taxi and headed straight to the international airport. I left a clear, honest letter on the kitchen counter explaining that I refused to raise our son in an environment where respect was optional. Halfway through airport security, My phone began ringing incessantly with frantic calls and messages from Brandon after he discovered the note. I finally answered the phone right before our flight began boarding, listening to my husband frantically stuttering in total disbelief. He asked me if I was really doing something this extreme, and I told him that protecting my dignity was not extreme at all. I explained that thinking I would spend 20 years begging for basic respect was the only insane part of our entire marriage, leaving him completely speechless for the first time ever. Moving across the world was challenging, but the fresh start allowed both my son and me to truly thrive. Seeing the massive distance finally forced Brandon to recognize how terribly his family had treated me over the years. He eventually offered a sincere, deeply reflective apology for his cowardice, and his mother and sister slowly followed suit once they realized they no longer possessed any power or control over my life. Today, my relationship with Brandon is far healthier because firm boundaries finally exist between us. I learned that respect is not something you beg people to give you, but rather something you demand by walking away from disrespect. If you enjoyed this emotional story of strength and transformation, please hit the subscribe button right now, and be sure to click on the video appearing on your end screen to watch another incredible story.